For 20 years, Nolan Reed believed his wife had drowned in the black water beneath Blackwater Lake, where a burned-out car was pulled from the depths, but no body was ever found. He built a quiet life out of the wreckage, raising their son alone, filling his evenings with engine grease and silence instead of grief he refused to name. Then, on a rain-soaked afternoon at the train station, he saw a face he had buried 2 decades earlier. Beside her stood a young woman with gray eyes that matched his own, eyes he had only ever seen in a mirror and in his son's face. The woman he had mourned looked at him, trembling, and whispered 4 words that undid everything he thought he understood about his own life. She told him not to say her name, because someone was still watching them. If you want to know how a wife the world called dead survived 20 years in silence, stay until the end, because the truth she carries will cost someone everything. Nolan Reed had come to the Blackwater train station for nothing more complicated than a crate of parts for the 1967 Mustang sitting half-finished in his shop, and he had expected the afternoon to end the way most of his afternoons ended, with grease under his fingernails and the radio playing low while he worked in peace. His life had settled into something manageable over the years, a small restoration garage on the edge of town, a house that still smelled faintly of sawdust, and a son named Elliot, who called less often now that he had built a career of his own 2 states away. Nolan had made peace, or something close to it, with the shape his life had taken after the accident that stole his wife from him when Elliot was barely 3 years old. He did not expect the crowd at the station to part the way it did, or for his eyes to land on a woman standing near the ticket counter whose face stopped his breath in his chest. She was older, thinner, and her eyes kept sliding toward the exits the way a person's eyes move when they have spent years learning not to be found. The station smelled of wet concrete and diesel, and somewhere behind him a departure board clattered through its rotations. But Nolan barely registered any of it. His whole body suddenly narrowed down to the single fact of her face. Nolan told himself it was impossible, that grief could conjure faces out of strangers if a man let it. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became that this was not a trick of memory. It was Maren. His wife, the woman he had married in a church with peeling paint and buried in a coffin that the coroner had sworn contained her remains, was standing 30 feet away in a station full of people who had no idea the ground beneath them had just shifted. Beside her stood a young woman, no older than 20, with dark hair and a familiar set to her jaw, and eyes the exact shade of gray that Nolan saw every morning in the mirror and had seen in his son's face since the day the boy was born. Nolan said her name before he could stop himself, and the sound of it seemed to physically strike her, because Maren flinched and grabbed the younger woman's arm and began pulling her toward the far doors before he had even taken a full step forward. He caught up to them on the sidewalk outside, rain starting to needle down around them, and demanded to know how a dead woman was standing in front of him breathing. Maren would not look at him directly, her attention fixed instead on a black sport utility vehicle idling across the street, its windows tinted dark enough that Nolan could not tell if anyone sat inside. She told him, in a voice stripped thin by fear, that they could not be seen standing together in a place with cameras, and that every second they lingered increased a danger he did not yet understand. When he pressed her for an explanation, she asked only one thing of him, that he take them somewhere no one would think to look. Before Nolan could answer, the young woman turned to Maren with a question that landed harder than anything else that afternoon. She asked, in a voice caught between hope and disbelief, whether this stranger standing in the rain was truly her father. Nolan drove them to the old storage building behind his garage, a space he used for parts he no longer needed but could not bring himself to throw away, and for a long moment none of them spoke, while rain drummed against the metal roof. The single bulb overhead buzzed and swayed slightly whenever wind pushed through a gap in the siding, throwing long shadows across shelves crowded with carburetors and coiled hose, and the smell of old motor oil settled over the three of them like something almost comforting in its ordinariness. Nolan sat on an overturned crate because his legs did not entirely trust him to stand, and he found himself studying the two women across from him the way he might study an engine that refused to start, searching for the one detail that would explain everything. He could not stop looking at the young woman, could not reconcile the shape of her face with anything he understood about his own history. Yet some old animal instinct in him refused to dismiss what his eyes kept insisting was true. Maren finally broke the silence, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of coffee she had not touched, and told him that when she vanished 20 years earlier, she had been carrying a child neither of them yet knew existed. Nolan felt some cold move through his chest, because even in the depths of his grief, he had never imagined a version of the truth that included a daughter he had never been told about. The young woman introduced herself as Sloane Hart, though she said the surname carefully, as though it belonged to a costume rather than a name. She explained that she had grown up believing her father died before she was born, a story repeated so many times that it had calcified into something she never thought to question. Only 2 weeks earlier, her mother had finally told her that her father was not dead at all, that he was alive and living less than a day's drive from where they had been hiding. Sloane did not call Nolan anything resembling a father in that first conversation, choosing instead to study him the way a person studies a stranger who happens to share their face, cataloging the similarities without yet trusting what they might mean. Nolan noticed she pressed her fingers against the edge of the table when she grew tense, an unconscious habit identical to one he shared with Elliot, and the resemblance rattled him more than any words could have. He told them plainly that 2 decades of lies could not be undone by a resemblance, however striking, and that he needed proof before he let himself believe any of it. Maren agreed without hesitation, but warned him they could not send a sample to any ordinary laboratory, because Gideon Wycliffe had people embedded in hospitals, courts, and private data firms across the region. The name hit Nolan like a stone dropped into still water, because he remembered it from the earliest days of their marriage, back when Maren's family had made their disapproval of a small-town mechanic marrying into their world unmistakably clear. He understood then that whatever had pulled his wife back from the dead was not a simple story of a woman running from grief, but something far larger and far more dangerous than he had allowed himself to imagine. Before he could ask another question, Maren reached into her bag and set a photograph on the table between them, its edges worn soft from handling. It showed Nolan walking a 3-year-old Elliot into his first day of preschool, an ordinary morning frozen in time, except the photograph had clearly been taken 12 years after the date on Maren's death certificate. The story that unfolded that evening carried Nolan back 20 years, to a version of his life he had only ever understood in fragments. Maren had been born into the Wycliffe family, daughter of the late Augustus Wycliffe, the founder of Wycliffe Crown Holdings, an empire built across decades of shrewd investment and careful public image. She had never wanted the crown that came with the name, choosing instead to marry a mechanic from a town most of her relatives could not locate on a map, and she had endured her family's cold disapproval without complaint because Nolan had never once made her feel like a consolation prize. In the early years of their marriage, she used to joke that the Wycliffe name was a coat she had finally learned to take off, hanging it by the door of their small house, and stepping into a life measured in oil changes and grocery lists instead of boardrooms. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that distance alone would be enough to keep the family's ambitions from ever touching the life she had built for herself. After Augustus died, his younger brother Gideon assumed control of the company and, with it, control over nearly everything the Wycliffe name still touched. Marin had watched her uncle tighten his grip on the family's fortune with a patience that unsettled her long before she understood exactly why.